I reached a milestone the other day. I didn't even realize it. 50 episodes. On this episode of the Driving with Rob podcast. 50 episodes. Actually, I reached 50 episodes a couple of weeks ago and I didn't realize it. So this will actually be the 55th episode of the Driving with Rob podcast. So if you like the podcast, you've got 54 other podcasts that you can go back and listen to. Just go to the Driving with Rob podcast and you can scroll down and you can start at the very first one and listen to them all. But anyway, it is kind of a milestone, and I meant to call attention to it and, let you guys know that 50 episodes is a lot of episodes. And this actually being episode number 55. Since I started this thing back in, I think it was November of 2019. A lot of stuff has happened since November of 2019. November of 2019, there was no coronavirus as far as anybody knew. And now everybody has it. Or the news media would have you believe that everybody has it. And if you don't have it yet, you're going to get it. That's what they keep telling us. But what I try to do on my podcast, I don't like to talk about politics. I can talk about politics, but I don't want to. Because right now there are so many people talking about politics, and all it does is depress you or make you mad. I just talked to a friend of mine the other day, and I knew that she was left-leaning Democrat supporter. But it didn't stop us from being friends. And while I was on the phone with her, she actually wants me to do some electrical work at her house. She said, "I forgot that you were a Republican." And I said, "Yes, I'm one of those white, Southern, conservative, Christian Republicans that is the scourge of the planet. I am the type of person that your mother warned you about." And she just laughed. Because I've known her for a long time. We're still friends. We can disagree on politics but still be friends, and I like that. But the reason I don't talk about politics is it is so easy these days to trigger somebody. You can say anything that they disagree with. And certain people will instantly start trying to find fault with everything else you say. And kind of come to the conclusion that since we disagree on this one point, now we can no longer be friends. And now I must hate you forever. Remember when we could disagree politically but still be friends? I miss those days. But anyway, I never wanted the podcast to be about politics. Because there are too many people already talking about politics. Like I said, I have opinions. I just don't want to trigger you. Now, what I try to make this whole podcast about is just talking about day-to-day philosophical questions that we're all faced with and we all struggle with at one time or another. And looking back over some of the previous podcasts, I realized that there have been a lot of podcasts where I talk about death. Because this last couple of years has really kind of been a tough couple of years. People that I was friends with have passed away. People that I worked with have passed away. Relatives of the friends of mine. So a lot of the podcasts end up talking about death and how to deal with it. I try to talk about love a lot. And I should probably talk about it more often than I do. But I had a podcast called True Love Never Dies. And that kind of dovetailed into the discussion of a loved one who passed away. Because I believe that if you ever actually loved somebody, that you always will. No matter what. No matter what happens, no matter what they do to you, even if they passed away, even if they passed on, you still love them. No matter what. If you ever actually loved them in the first place. Because I don't think that true love ever goes away. I really don't. So that's one of the topics that I've talked about a lot. I also really try to not talk about religion on the podcast. Because religion is another one of those hot button topics that people get really passionate about when they talk about it. They'll get really mad. or really emotional when you start talking about religion? Because some people are really concrete thinkers. It's black or it's white, it's right or it's wrong, it's on or it's off. And some people have no room in their lives for gray areas. But I tend to think that human beings are way too complicated for absolutes. For yes or no, right or it's wrong, it's on or it's off. Because we are very deeply complex creatures. And you think, well, some things are absolute, some things are indisputable. You cannot argue that killing another person is wrong unless it's self-defense, unless you're fighting a war, unless you're defending a weaker person. See, even murder is not always black and white. You like to think it is. So there's still gray areas even when it comes down to killing another person, for taking another person's life. You make exceptions. It's always wrong. Unless I did a podcast on the 10 Commandments. And I'd really kind of like to go back and revisit that one and flesh out the points a little more. But a lot of my earlier podcasts weren't necessarily on the Golden Rule, but I mentioned the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule is basically a summation of the 10 Commandments. Because when they asked Jesus what was the greatest commandment, he gave them the Reader's Digest version. You may be too young to understand the analogy of the Reader's Digest version, but anyway, the thumbnail version. Jesus said, "Have no other gods before me, and love your neighbor as yourself. And if you do these two things, you will fulfill all the commandments." Not just the top 10 that everybody's familiar with. Because if you love somebody as much as you love yourself, you won't lie to them, steal from them, or try to kill them. Because those are things you would not do to yourself. And Jesus said if you do these two things, you've done them all. While at the same time realizing that it's only two things that you have to do. They're nearly impossible for most people. So I talk about the Golden Rule in a lot of my podcasts, as they apply to other topics. And the reason I prefer to talk about universal philosophical issues on the podcast, like life and death, like love and hate, these are things that everybody experiences, but nobody ever talks about them. Not really. Our minds and our lives are so cluttered up with what somebody else said, or someone else's priorities, and they're trying to convince you to have these same priorities. Life and death, love and hate, sadness and happiness, these are things that everybody goes through. It doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter what religion you are. It doesn't matter what age you are. We're all faced with these questions and these dilemmas, and how do you handle them? So that's what I prefer to talk about on the podcast. But this is the 55th episode of the Driving with Rob podcast. So I want to give you the opportunity now, since this is kind of a milestone, and it's actually beyond a milestone at this point because it's past 50. If there's a topic that you would like for me to talk about, leave me a comment and say, I'd like to hear about this. Or I want to know what you think about that. Because we're all on this journey together. And for a lot of topics, there's really not a right or wrong. I believe there are a lot of gray areas. And I'm ready to talk about them. So if there's a particular topic that you would like to hear me expound upon in my own limited way, I'll do that. So I'm going to let you pick a topic. You pick a topic, and that's what I'll talk about on the next episode of the Driving with Rob podcast. Thanks for downloading. Thanks for listening. I really do appreciate all the listeners that I have and the people that download and support me on this, because this is something I enjoy doing, and I'd like to keep doing it. But if you've got a topic that you'd like to hear me talk about, leave me a comment, or you can send me an email to drivingwithrob1, the number 1, at yahoo.com. And any emails or messages, comments that I get, I'll try to respond to them. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye now.